Wasting money. Game collecting is one of my favorite hobbies. Recently, I've been going on a video game collecting spree, mainly just trying to fill out my Sonic game collection. Eventually, I did end up getting every Sonic game for the Genesis, so that's at least one part of the collection complete. But after that, I wanted more. I wanted to keep collecting other Sonic games I didn't have. Maybe Sonic CD, the Game Gear games, hell, maybe even the Sega Saturn games like Sonic R and Sonic Jam. So I went to eBay and started searching, but there was one slight issue I ran into. These games are so fucking expensive. Rare Sonic games are games in the Sonic franchise that aren't necessarily good by any means, but they are extremely uncommon to find in the wild, due to their low sales and low amount of copies produced. This causes the prices to be jacked up so high to the point where some of these games cost the same amount as a new console. At that point, you would just be better off emulating the game if you really want to play it that badly, is what a quitter would say. As a game collector, I just gotta have these games all lined up on a shelf. There's just something about having that. So let's take a look at some of the rarest Sonic games, shall we? Out of all of the Genesis Sonic games I purchased, Sonic 3 was by far the most expensive at around 60 bucks, with Sonic and Knuckles coming in at a close second at around 50 bucks. That isn't even comparable to the other Genesis-esque Sonic game, Sonic CD, which comes in at a whopping 80 to 90 bucks depending on how lucky you get. That is the game complete in box with the manual. And also, for future reference, all of the prices I'm talking about are the complete in box prices. Anyway, for basically just another classic Sonic game, let alone one of the less well received ones, this price is abysmally high. But why is that? Well, the Sega CD was just an add-on for the Genesis that only sold around 2 million units. The demand for this thing already wasn't high, but then you have the game itself, which sold a total of around 1.5 million copies, which is super impressive considering the sales of the console itself, but still, this was extremely low compared to other Sonic games at the time. The low sales of the console would naturally cause them to not produce as many copies, which is why it is so difficult to find this game at a decent price today. But we can go even deeper than that. Knuckles Chaotix is by far one of the rarest Sega games of all time, for numerous reasons. If you don't even know what this game is, then I honestly don't blame you, because it's one of the most obscure Genesis-era Sonic games. This game was released for the 32X, which is yet another add-on for the Genesis, but instead of around 2 million units sold like the Sega CD, the 32X only sold around 800,000 units worldwide. And that's not even the worst part. Taking into account the sales and low demand of the Sega 32X, I want you to take an educated guess on how many copies of Knuckles Chaotix were sold. Did you say 1 million? Well, nope, you're wrong. 500,000? I mean, you're getting there, but you're still wrong. What about 100,000? Yeah, no, still not even close. Would you believe me if I told you that Knuckles Chaotix sold a total of 24,000 copies? 24,000. There are more people subscribed to this channel than copies of Knuckles Chaotix in the world. How insane is that? No, seriously though, guys, like, thank you. That's pretty awesome. This extreme shortage of the game caused copies to cost up to $300 for complete in box. And regardless of how good a game is, it will never be worth that price. And Knuckles Chaotix wasn't even that good in the eyes of many, which most likely contributed to its low sales. The new mechanics introduced in the game were just not appealing to a general audience. So there was little to no interest in the game and the console it was sold for. That's why this game is one of the rarest Sonic games today. But the 32X was just a simple add-on for the Genesis. What if we look at an actual console that was a commercial failure? Let's look at the Sega Saturn. So at this point, Sega was holding on for dear life when it came to producing video game consoles. And while the Sega Saturn was a good console, it wasn't popular in the slightest compared to the competition. Combine this with the fact that every Sonic game made for the console faced low sales in production, and like Knuckles Chaotix, these prices were jacked up. If you want to buy complete in-box Sonic games for the Saturn, you'll be spending up to $200 every time. A total of 3 Sonic games were released for the Sega Saturn, with absolutely none of them being mainline releases. So that doesn't help our case. The least rare of these games is Sonic 3D Blast, pricing around $50 to $75, which is not bad in the slightest. This game was a cross-generation release on the Genesis and Saturn, but it was only ported to the Saturn to take Sonic Extreme's place because that game was canceled for several reasons. Sonic 3D Blast was always supposed to be a Genesis game, and when Sega's debut fully 3D Sonic game got canceled on the system that was supposed to rival the N64 and PlayStation 1, then they had to panic. Thankfully, since 3D Blast was marketed as a 3D game, even though it's not, this still caused a lot of people to buy it on the Saturn. And yeah, it was one of the most popular Sega Saturn games. However, sales weren't perfect because the Saturn wasn't performing, and the same game with some graphical differences was still available on the Sega Genesis. And since most people at the time had a Genesis, they saw no reason to buy the Saturn for the new Sonic game because it was already available on the console they already owned, making Sonic 3D Blast for the Saturn not necessarily rare, but fairly uncommon. But then we have Sonic R. Holy shit. Say what you will about this game, but personally, I think it's pretty f***ing awesome. Not $250 awesome though. Before writing this video, I had no idea just how expensive this game was. I knew the game was fairly obscure, but it's not as obscure as other games in this video, so I was just baffled. Obviously, not many people bought this game for the same reasons as 3D Blast. On top of that, the game was only made to compete with other racing games that were currently taking the world by storm, like Mario Kart 64. But even then, considering that the game was still a Sonic game, I was thinking at least 300,000 copies of this thing were sold, but that was being way too generous. This game sold a whopping 80,000 copies. I mean, it's not nearly as bad as Knuckles Chaotix, but still. This is awful. So yeah, the price makes sense now. As much as I do enjoy this game though, this price will never be worth it. Even with being able to own the original release, you're just much better off owning the PC version or Gems Collection to play the game. This one is just way too overpriced. And then we have Sonic Jam, which is honestly one of the better Sonic collections despite the game being super rare. This game was practically our first good introduction to 3D Sonic through the game's hub world, and it was cool. But other than that, all that's here are ports of the 4 OG Sonic Genesis games. But for a collection, this is more than enough content. Is it $200 worth of content? Absolutely not. Similar to Sonic R, Sonic Jam also sold around 80,000 copies. Now, since this is just a collection, then that number is slightly more reasonable, but it also makes it so the prices are jacked up to oblivion. Since this game was only a collection of games that people probably already owned and played on their Genesis, then there was no reason to buy this collection. Sure, being able to play these games on the new console would have been cool, but it wouldn't have been worth it if you already owned those games on a different console. So Sonic Jam, being one of the rarest Sonic games, doesn't surprise me in the slightest because it didn't sell well and it was on the Sega Saturn. So there were a lot of rare Sonic games back in the days when Sega was making consoles. But nowadays, Sonic games aren't all that rare anymore. Sure, you'll find a game every now and again that'll set you back around 50 bucks, mainly the GameCube ones, but other than that, Sonic games from 2000 and beyond aren't that rare. You can find them in the wild for fairly cheap actually. I guess the rarest Sonic game I own is actually Mario and Sonic at the Rio 2016 Olympic Games. I am not proud of how much I spent on this game, but I just had to complete the Olympic Games collection. Just to give you an idea, this game will set you back around 70 to 80 bucks on eBay. I don't know why this version of the game is so rare, but I guess they just produced a small amount of copies. The game sold as well as it could given that it was on the Wii U, so its obscurity is likely caused by the Wii U's failure. And if it wasn't obvious already, that's why a lot of these games are so rare in the first place. These were all released on consoles that were commercial failures. The Sega CD, 32X, Saturn, and Wii U are all consoles that did not sell well. So naturally, a game that didn't sell well on those consoles would be uncommon. But yeah, that's a quick look into some rare Sonic games. I really hope you all enjoyed this video because this topic in particular is something I'm pretty passionate about. So let me know what you think about these games in the comments down below. But thank you all so much for watching, and I will see you all later. Goodbye.